"Can I build one more?" They laughed at the old veteran, not knowing he built America's memorials. If you love American stories full of culture and emotion, subscribe now, leave a like. Comment what you think about this story and share this video so more people can enjoy them too. The Small Town Veterans fundraiser buzzed with energy as people filled the hall. Flags lined the walls, their red, white, and blue colors glowing under soft yellow lights. At the head tables, wealthy donors adjusted their suits, ready to make polished speeches. The smell of barbecue drifted in from outside, mixing with laughter and the hum of conversation. For a moment it felt like every corner of America was represented in that single room. Near the back door, Walter Miller stepped in quietly, unnoticed by most. His shoulders slouched with age, but his hands told another story. They were rough, calloused, the kind of hands that had worked wood for a lifetime. His carpenter's jacket, frayed at the edges, looked out of place against the polished blazers. He scanned the room, not with envy, but with the steady gaze of someone who had seen harder days. Walter paused, taking in the decorations strung across the rafters. Stars and stripes hung proudly, while a large banner read, "Building the Future Veterans Center." Beneath it, Ethan Brooks, the young developer leading the fundraiser, stood like he owned the hall. He shook hands, smiled wide for cameras, and carried himself with the confidence of wealth. To many, he was the face of progress. To Walter, he was just a boy who had never swung a hammer in service of the nation. The crowd cheered as speeches began. A local choir sang "God Bless America," and veterans in uniform stood tall with pride. Families clapped and waved small flags, their eyes misting with emotion. It was a night meant to honor sacrifice and raise money for the future. Yet in the corner Walter stood still, his presence almost invisible. No one knew the weight of history carried in his quiet frame. When the choir ended, Ethan took the stage, his voice booming across the room. He thanked the donors, praised their generosity, and spoke of legacy. Words filled with pride and ambition spilled out like polished stone. People nodded, applauded, and raised their glasses. Walter listened, lips pressed tight, recognizing the empty shine of speeches compared to the depth of real sacrifice. Walter moved forward slowly, weaving through the crowd. Each step felt heavy, not from age alone, but from a life of silence. He wanted a seat closer to the stage, to hear clearly, to feel part of the honor being celebrated. Yet as he approached, eyes followed him, curious, skeptical, almost dismissive. He didn't fit the picture painted for the night. He was a scar in a room designed to look flawless. Near the front he paused, waiting for a chance to sit. His cane tapped lightly on the floor, a soft reminder of years that had passed. He tried to smile at a young couple, but they turned away, whispering to each other. He didn't blame them. Society had a way of moving past men like him. To most, he was just an old veteran, too worn to matter anymore. Still, he pressed forward with quiet determination. The fundraiser rolled on, voices blending together. Waitresses moved between tables with trays of food and glasses of sweet tea. Among them was Emily Carter, a college student working to pay tuition. She noticed Walter's struggle to find a seat and felt a tug of compassion. Her eyes lingered on him longer than most, sensing there was more behind his weathered face than the world cared to see. Walter finally stopped near an empty chair close to the stage. For the first time that night, he let his hands rest on the back of the chair, steadying himself. He thought of the places his hands had shaped wooden benches in small towns, carved plaques in quiet corners. Yet here, in this room of wealth and power, he was only another old man. Still he sat down, his heart steady, waiting to see what the night would bring. The hall buzzed on, filled with pride and pageantry. Walter blended into the background, his legacy unknown to everyone around him. The night would soon test him in ways he hadn't expected. The polished speeches would clash with the truth of sacrifice, and in that clash Walter's silence would finally be broken. As Walter settled into the chair, the air shifted. Ethan Brooks noticed him from the stage and frowned. The developer leaned toward the microphone with a smirk. "Sir," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "this section is for guests of honor and donors. Shouldn't you be resting at home?" The crowd chuckled softly, uneasy, but entertained. The moment cut through the warmth of the evening like a knife. Walter straightened his back, refusing to let the insult show. His eyes stayed steady on Ethan, but his silence gave the young man confidence to continue. Ethan laughed lightly, looking at the audience as though to share the joke. "What could an old man like you possibly bring to this table?" His words carried arrogance, feeding off the crowd's desire to laugh at someone other than themselves. The insult hung in the air. The donors smirked, whispering across linen-covered tables. Some shook their heads, embarrassed by the scene, but few spoke up. To them, Walter was just an interruption to the show. They didn't see the years of sacrifice behind his weary face. They saw only gray hair, a faded jacket, and the image of someone who no longer belonged in the spotlight. In that moment, the hall became a mirror of society's judgment. Emily Carter, balancing a tray nearby, stopped mid-step. Her chest tightened as she heard the laughter aimed at Walter. She glanced at him, hoping he might defend himself, but he sat quietly, weathering the ridicule with dignity. She wanted to speak, but fear held her back. After all, who would listen to a waitress over the wealthy host of the night? Still, her heart stirred with silent defiance. Ethan continued, relishing the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his glass, "tonight is about building the future, not clinging to the past. Let's honor those who can truly move us forward." Applause followed, shallow and quick, but enough to sting. Walter lowered his head, not in shame, but in reflection. His thoughts drifted to the men he had served with, the memorials he had built, and the weight of every carved name he carried in his soul. For a flicker of a moment, Walter considered leaving. The room didn't want him. The world had dismissed him too many times before. But as he tightened his grip on his cane, he decided to stay. Something deeper held him there, a quiet defiance rooted not in pride, but in truth. He knew that his life's work could not be erased by a sneer. The hall may laugh now, but history had already recorded his worth. Emily placed her tray on a nearby table and leaned closer, whispering just loud enough for Walter to hear. "Don't let him get to you," she said softly. Her words were brief, but they carried more weight than the applause filling the room. Walter lifted his eyes and gave a small nod of gratitude. In her kindness he saw a glimmer of hope. Someone still recognized dignity when they saw it. The rest of the hall moved on quickly, returning to speeches and laughter. Yet the mockery lingered like smoke after a fire. Walter sat quietly, staring at the stage, his jaw tight. He remembered the countless hours shaping wood for memorials across the country. Every scar on his hands told a story of service and legacy. And now those same hands were mocked as useless. The irony cut deep. Ethan, confident that the moment had passed, raised his voice again. This fundraiser is for builders, leaders, and donors. We don't need relics, swinging hammers. We need progress. The words struck like a hammer itself, intended to bury Walter under the weight of ridicule. But instead of crumbling, Walter whispered to himself, "Sometimes a man's worth isn't in his wallet, but in his hands." His heart steadied. The night was far from over. The room continued to glow with lights, music, and chatter. But beneath the polished surface, tension grew. Walter's quiet defiance had planted something unshakable in the air. Ethan thought he had silenced the old man, yet he had only sparked the beginning of a story no one expected. The banquet hall would not remain the same, for truth has a way of breaking through even the loudest laughter. The laughter in the hall still lingered like smoke after a fire. Ethan grinned, believing he had won the moment, while the donors leaned back in their chairs with smirks. Walter, however, did not flinch. He sat upright, his weathered hands folded across his cane, eyes steady as the noise swirled around him. The silence he held was not weakness, but something deeper, carved from years of service and sacrifice. Finally, Walter lifted his head, his voice low but clear enough to reach the microphone. "Sometimes," he said, pausing as the crowd leaned closer, "a man's worth isn't in his wallet, but in his hands." The words, simple and unpolished, fell into the air with surprising weight. They cut through the noise with a kind of quiet authority, almost old-fashioned yet undeniably firm. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some chuckled, brushing it off as the ramblings of a tired old man. Others glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh or listen. Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically, inviting the audience to dismiss Walter's words. "Poetic," he muttered, "but empty." Still, a strange tension hung in the air, as though the room itself knew something had just changed. Emily Carter, standing with a tray near the stage, froze. Her chest tightened at Walter's words, recognizing the pride hidden beneath them. She stared at his hands, rough and scarred, and wondered what they had built across a lifetime. Unlike the others, she didn't laugh. She held her breath, struck by a sense that truth had just been spoken, even if no one else saw it. Walter lowered his gaze again, unwilling to defend himself further. He had said all that needed saying. His heart pounded, not with anger but with quiet resolve. Years of silence had taught him restraint, and tonight would be no different. Still, deep inside a flicker of defiance had awakened, a fire that Ethan's ridicule could not extinguish. Ethan, annoyed that the moment had not landed as strongly as he hoped, leaned forward once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a mocking smile, "I think we can all agree that sentiment is nice, but this is about the future, and the future isn't built with dusty hands." The audience chuckled lightly, but not as confidently as before. Walter's words had left a mark. Emily moved closer to Walter, pretending to refill glasses at the table beside him. She whispered as she passed. That was powerful. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with sincerity. Walter gave her a small nod, appreciating her courage. For the first time that evening, he felt less alone. At the donor tables, murmurs spread. Some dismissed Walter entirely, but others questioned what he meant. Was he a carpenter? Had he actually built something of significance? Their whispers floated across the hall like drifting smoke, small but growing with each word. Ethan's face tightened. He could feel control slipping. Walter sat in silence once again, his lips pressed together. He wasn't here to boast or beg for recognition. He came for fellowship, for the spirit of remembrance, not applause. Yet the seed had been planted. His quiet reply was more powerful than Ethan realized. As the music resumed and waitresses moved through the aisles, Ethan clenched his jaw. He sensed that the old man's words, if left unchecked, could stir the room. And so, in front of every one, he planned his next move, one that would not only belittle Walter, but challenge him outright. The microphone squealed as Ethan tapped it, pulling the crowd's attention back. He smiled broadly, though irritation glinted in his eyes. "My friends," he said, pacing the stage, "we've heard some poetic words tonight, but words alone don't build centers or monuments or a future worth having." His voice carried the polished arrogance of a man used to winning applause. The audience chuckled, eager for entertainment. Ethan gestured toward Walter, his smirk sharpening like a blade. "If this gentleman believes his hands are worth more than money, then perhaps he should show us. Tell us, old man, what have you ever built that truly matters?" The question rang through the hall, heavy with mockery. Laughter burst again, louder this time, feeding off Ethan's energy. A few donors slapped the table, egging him on. To them it was a harmless joke, an evening's amusement at the expense of an old man. But beneath the laughter was unease. They didn't yet know why Walter's stillness carried such quiet strength. Walter's chest rose slowly as he took in the challenge. His eyes didn't leave Ethan's, even as the crowd jeered. The words, "What have you built?" echoed like thunder in his memory, stirring visions of carved wood, engraved plaques, and benches where grieving families had sat. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent, unwilling to reveal his truth too soon. Emily's heart raced as she watched from the edge of the room. She gripped her tray tightly, knuckles white, wishing she could silence Ethan. But she knew her place, a waitress in a room of wealth and power. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Hold on, Walter. Don't let him crush you." Her eyes never left the veteran's face. Ethan strutted across the stage, satisfied with the laughter he had stirred. "See?" he shouted, spreading his arms wide. "Silence. That's all the past can give us, silence. Tonight is about builders of tomorrow, not relics of yesterday." His words landed with force, designed to bury Walter beneath ridicule. Walter's cane tapped once against the floor, a soft but steady sound. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with patience. The fire inside him grew stronger, though he kept it hidden. If Ethan wanted to challenge him, then so be it. Truth had a way of rising at the right moment. The crowd roared again, their laughter mixed with clapping. Yet in the corner of the room a few veterans shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They had seen men like Walter before, men underestimated, mocked, but carrying legacies far greater than anyone realized. Their silence carried its own quiet respect. Walter lowered his head briefly, letting the storm pass. He whispered to himself, "They don't know yet." His hands tightened on the cane, knuckles pale. He knew that sooner or later his past would speak louder than Ethan's insults. Ethan raised his glass high, sealing the moment with one final insult. "Prove it, old man," he declared, grinning at the crowd. "If you've ever built anything that matters, prove it here tonight." The hall erupted with laughter and applause, But beneath the noise, the spark in Walter's eyes burned brighter. The challenge had been set, and the night would never be the same. The applause from Ethan's challenge still echoed through the hall, but the energy had shifted. Beneath the laughter, small murmurs began to stir. A few guests whispered to each other, uncertain if mocking the old veteran was truly the right tone for a night meant to honor service. The bright lights gleamed on polished glasses, but unease lingered in the corners. Emily Carter, still clutching her tray, couldn't hold back any more. Her voice, though soft, carried into the silence between speeches. "He's a veteran," she said, looking directly at Ethan. "He deserves respect." Her words struck like a pebble tossed into still water, rippling outward. Heads turned, startled by her boldness. Ethan's smile faltered for only a second, but he quickly recovered. He raised his hand dismissively, as though shooing away an insect. "Respect is earned, young lady," he said loudly, making sure the microphone carried his words. "And it's not handed out for free." The crowd chuckled uneasily, unsure whether to applaud or stay silent. Walter sat still, his eyes fixed on the floor. He did not rise to defend himself. The weight of years had taught him that dignity often rests in silence. Yet Emily's small act of defiance warmed his heart. Someone had spoken for him, even when the room was against him. A group of donors at the nearest table shook their heads. "This isn't the time for pity," one muttered. "The man's out of place." Another sipped his drink, adding, "He should have stayed home." Their words carried the cold judgment of those who had never known sacrifice. Ethan, emboldened by the murmurs, leaned toward the microphone again. "Tonight is about vision," he declared. "It's about building the future, not clinging to the shadows of the past." His words washed over the room like polished stone, smooth but empty. The donors clapped, eager to restore order. But not everyone was convinced. In the back, a few older veterans exchanged quiet glances. They had heard Ethan's speeches before, polished, practiced, shallow, and though Walter remained silent, his presence carried weight that no amount of arrogance could erase. Something about him still unsettled them. Emily lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushed. She worried that speaking out had only made things worse. But when she glanced at Walter, she saw him nod ever so slightly. It wasn't thanks in words, but gratitude spoken in the language of resilience. She felt a surge of courage. The hall moved on, or tried to. Speeches resumed, laughter returned, but the seed had been planted. Doubt lingered, silent yet steady, spreading quietly across the room. What if the old man was more than what he seemed? What if Ethan had underestimated him? As the evening pressed forward, the room felt divided. Some clung to Ethan's words, others began to wonder. In that tension, Walter's silence grew heavier, not as weakness, but as a quiet force waiting for its moment. The story of the night was not finished. It was only beginning to turn. Colonel James Stevens, a retired officer seated near the front, had been quiet all evening. He had listened to the speeches, the mockery, and the soft defense of the young waitress, but his eyes kept returning to Walter. There was something in the veteran's bearing and the way he held himself despite the humiliation that stirred old memories. Stevens studied Walter's hands, resting firmly on his cane. They were rough, scarred, worn from decades of labor. They were not the hands of a man who had sat idly in retirement. They were builder's hands, steady, strong, and purposeful. Something about them, tugged at Stephen's memory. He thought of Arlington, of the wooden benches scattered along the shaded paths where families sat to mourn their fallen. He remembered the carved eagles that stood watch in state memorials. The work had always struck him as masterful, though no name was attached to it. Now, staring at Walter, a suspicion began to form. Ethan continued his speech, full of boasts and promises, but Stevens barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the quiet man who sat alone, half hidden by the glare of the stage lights. He sensed that Walter's story ran deeper than anyone in the room could imagine. Emily passed near the colonel's table with her tray, and Stevens caught her arm gently. "That old man," he whispered, nodding toward Walter. "Do you know who he is?" Emily shook her head, but her eyes brightened. "Only that he deserves more respect than he's getting," she said firmly. Stevens leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had seen men dismissed before good men, forgotten men, who carried more legacy than any wealthy donor could buy. He wasn't certain yet, but the thought gnawed at him. Had he seen Walter's work before in sacred places where America bows her head? The rest of the hall remained oblivious, swept up in Ethan's polished show. Glasses clinked, donors laughed, and the choir prepared another patriotic song. But Stephen's thoughts would not leave him. He felt the weight of recognition pressing against his chest. Walter sat quietly, unaware of the colonel's watchful eyes. His heart was steady, but a storm brewed beneath the surface. He could sense that the night was moving toward a breaking point. Ethan had thrown down a challenge, and truth had a way of answering in its own time. Emily glanced back at Walter as she worked, catching a glimpse of his faraway stare. She wondered what memories filled his silence. She wondered what those hands had built. And so, beneath the laughter and the speeches, a new thread of tension wove itself through the night. Seeds of doubt had been planted, and now a hint of legacy stirred quietly, waiting to rise. The fundraiser had rolled on with polished speeches and laughter, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Ethan paced the stage with his usual swagger, soaking in the applause of donors who clung to every shallow word. "Only real builders and real donors will shape the new Veterans Center," he declared, his voice sharp as glass. The hall buzzed with polite approval, but a few faces tightened, sensing the cruelty behind the remark. Walter sat still, his cane firm against the floor, his silence holding weight. Ethan's eyes darted toward Walter again, hungry for another laugh at the old man's expense. He raised his glass, his grin mocking. "Let us move forward with vision," he said, pointing toward the veteran, as if calling out a trespasser. "We can't let ghosts of the past decide the future." The crowd chuckled softly, eager to follow the lead of the man who held the microphone. Yet beneath the laughter unease spread like a thin crack in glass. Walter's heart thudded quietly in his chest. He had endured mockery before, from strangers, from life itself, but tonight felt different. Tonight the disrespect was not aimed at just him, but at every man and woman who had sacrificed for this country. He gripped the handle of his cane tighter, his knuckles pale, as Ethan's words echoed in his ears. Emily Carter stood frozen near the tables, her tray trembling in her hands. She wanted to shout, to stop the cruel show, but her voice failed her. All she could do was watch, praying that Walter would not retreat into silence again. Something in her gut told her the night was reaching its breaking point. Colonel Stevens shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as Ethan's words cut deeper. He recognized the venom disguised as charm, the arrogance wrapped in patriotism. His eyes flicked to Walter, studying the old man's steady posture. Stevens thought, this man has endured worse than ridicule, and he will not stay quiet forever. The choir, waiting to sing again, fidgeted uncomfortably in the corner. Even they felt the shift in the room, though no one dared speak. Ethan strutted across the stage as though he owned the night, but something about the old veteran's silence seemed to steal his confidence. The mockery no longer landed with the same force. Walter inhaled slowly, rising from his chair with measured strength. The crowd stilled as his figure straightened, shoulders squared like a soldier long retired but never broken. His cane tapped once on the wooden floor, echoing louder than expected. For the first time the hall gave him its full attention, if only out of curiosity. Ethan smirked, ready for another round of entertainment at the veteran's expense. "What is it, old man?" he asked, voice dripping with disdain. "Have something else to add?" The donors chuckled, bracing for a feeble reply. But their laughter began to fade as Walter's eyes locked on Ethan, clear and unwavering. Walter's voice broke the silence, firm yet calm. "You speak of builders," he said, his words carrying farther than anyone expected. "Then let me tell you what I've built." His tone was not angry, not desperate, but steady, the voice of a man who had lived through storms and outlasted them all. The hall went silent. Glasses stopped mid-air, forks froze above plates, and even Ethan's grin faltered. For the first time that night, the balance shifted. The breaking point had arrived, and the old veteran was no longer invisible. The crowd leaned in as Walter's words settled like a stone dropped into still water. He stood tall, his cane pressed against the floor, his eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. "I have built benches," he said, his voice low but steady. "Small ones in town squares where families sit to pray for their sons who never came home." His words hung heavy, painting pictures no one could dismiss. A ripple moved through the audience. Some donors smirked, exchanging glances as if to say, "That's it? Benches?" Others frowned, uncertain. Ethan seized the moment, letting out a sharp laugh that rang hollow. "Benches?" he repeated mockingly, pacing across the stage. "You mean to tell us your legacy is a few pieces of wood in small towns?" Walter did not flinch. His voice carried again, this time firmer. "Yes, benches where mothers have clutched folded flags, where fathers have bowed their heads in silence, where children light candles for brothers they'll never see again." His eyes did not leave Ethan's, but his words pierced the hearts of those who listened. Emily's throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes. She remembered her own uncle's funeral, the wooden bench outside the church where she and her family sat to grieve. Could it have been one of his? She held her tray tightly, knowing she was witnessing something far greater than another shallow fundraiser. Colonel Stevens leaned forward, his hand on the table. His mind flickered with memories of Arlington and other memorials across the nation. The craftsmanship of those benches, the carvings on plaques he had seen, suddenly felt alive again in Walter's words. His suspicion grew stronger, though he kept silent for now. Ethan waved dismissively, his voice dripping with mockery. "So the old man made a few benches. That's supposed to impress us? That's supposed to prove you belong here tonight?" He turned back to the donors, inviting their laughter. But this time the laughter came slower, weaker, uncertain. Walter let the silence stretch before speaking again. "It is not the size of the wood," he said firmly, "but the weight it carries. And those benches carry the weight of America's grief." His voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from the depth of memory behind the words. The hall grew quieter still. Donors shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding Walter's gaze, others unable to look away. They had come expecting polished speeches and shallow entertainment, but something real was unfolding before them. The truth in his words was undeniable, no matter how Ethan tried to twist it. Emily whispered to herself, "They don't see it yet, but they will." Her eyes never left Walter, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and sorrow. For the first time, she believed this night would not end with humiliation, but with revelation. Ethan clenched the microphone tighter, his smirk forced. "Is that all you've got, old man?" he sneered. But inside he felt a flicker of unease. For every word he mocked, Walter's quiet truth only seemed to grow stronger. The first reveal had been made, and the night was far from over. The hall sat in uneasy silence after Walter's steady words. Ethan still paced the stage, but the mockery no longer drew the same laughter. Murmurs drifted across the tables, scattered and uncertain. A shift was happening, subtle but undeniable. For the first time, the spotlight didn't belong to Ethan. It hovered over Walter, the old veteran with calloused hands and quiet strength. Colonel James Stevens, seated near the front, leaned forward. His eyes narrowed as Walter's description of benches stirred something in his memory. The carved edges, the steady craftsmanship, the weight those benches carried. He had seen them before. They weren't just in small town squares. They stood in places sacred to America's grief. The colonel's heart beat faster as the pieces clicked together. "Wait," Stevens said suddenly, his voice cutting through the whispers. Heads turned toward him, surprised at the interruption. He rose slowly from his chair, his uniform jacket straight despite his age. His eyes locked on Walter. "Those benches you speak of, the ones with eagles carved into the arms. I've seen them." His voice carried a new kind of weight, one born of recognition. The audience shifted uneasily. Some furrowed brows, others tilted their heads. A ripple of curiosity moved through the hall. Ethan froze mid-step, caught off guard by the colonel's words. For the first time that night, his smirk faltered. Doubt crept across the room like a draught of cold air. The certainty of mockery was breaking apart. Walter remained still, his cane steady against the wooden floor. He did not respond immediately, letting Stevens' words sink into the crowd. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult Ethan had thrown. For once the old veteran did not look like a man out of place. He looked like someone the colonel, a man of service, knew to honor. Emily Carter clasped her tray tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with anticipation. She felt the shift before most others. For hours Walter had been invisible, dismissed as a relic. But now his truth was being uncovered by someone who carried respect in the room. Emily whispered softly, "They're starting to see it." Her heart swelled with quiet pride. Colonel Stevens turned to the audience, his voice firm. "I've walked through Arlington. I've seen families weep on those benches. I've studied the detail in the wood, the eagles, the carvings no machine could make. Those weren't ordinary benches." His gaze returned to Walter. "Old soldier, were they yours?" The question hung heavy, like a call to arms. Ethan's jaw tightened. He gripped the microphone, desperate to take back control. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, forcing a laugh. "You're letting nostalgia cloud your memory. He's just an old carpenter looking for attention." But the laughter he sought didn't come. The donors shifted uneasily, their confidence shaken by Stephen's certainty. The room had begun to turn. Walter finally lifted his eyes to meet the colonel's. His silence spoke volumes, but a faint nod gave the answer the crowd was waiting for. Gasps rippled through the hall as realization began to take root. The useless old man wasn't just a carpenter. He might be the craftsman of sacred places where America bows its head in grief and pride. The night was shifting, and recognition had sparked. The murmurs swelled, echoing across the hall. Donors who had mocked now leaned forward, their curiosity stronger than their arrogance. Walter stood tall, his cane like a staff anchoring him in place. The silence that followed was not dismissive anymore. It was the silence of a crowd waiting to hear the truth. Even Ethan's polished words could not fill it. Walter's voice came low but steady, each word deliberate. "For decades I built in silence. No name carved, no credit asked for. But the benches you've sat on, the plaques you've bowed your heads to, the memorials where America grieves my hands shaped them." His words flowed like truth long restrained, now finally set free. The crowd leaned in, almost breathless. Gasps spread as faces turned toward one another. Some remembered trips to Arlington, to state memorials, to quiet parks where wood held their tears. The carvings, the detail, the weight of loss and pride, it all came rushing back. For the first time, they began to connect their own memories with the old man standing before them. He wasn't nameless anymore. Emily's heart pounded as tears blurred her vision. She remembered her uncle's funeral, the wooden plaque outside the church where she and her family had gathered. Could it have been his? The thought shook her, filling her with awe. She whispered it was always him, though no one heard. To her, Walter had become more than a veteran. He was a guardian of memory. Colonel Stevens stood tall, his hand pressed firmly against the table. "I knew it," he declared, his voice commanding. "Those carvings in Arlington, the benches, the plaques, they were yours. I should have recognized it sooner." His words were not just confirmation, but an honor, lifting Walter from invisibility into recognition. The colonel's authority sealed the truth. Ethan, cornered and desperate, clung to his arrogance. "So he carved wood, furniture, that's all this is." His laugh rang hollow, weak. "Are we really going to let a carpenter steal the spotlight from real builders and donors?" But the words didn't land. Instead of laughter, he was met with stares, cold and silent. His grip on the room was crumbling fast. Walter lifted his cane slightly, his eyes unwavering. "Every name you've ever read on a plaque, every tear shed on a bench, every moment of silence at a memorial, you've stood in the work of my hands. You mocked these hands tonight, but for decades you've bowed your head at what they built." His voice grew firmer, carrying a pride he had long kept hidden. The hall fell utterly silent. Forks lay untouched, glasses frozen mid-air. Donors, veterans, families, all of them saw the old man in a new light. He was no longer a stranger, no longer a relic. He was the craftsman of America's grief, the builder of its sacred memory. Recognition had given way to revelation, and no one could dismiss him now. Emily pressed her hands together, whispering a prayer of thanks. Colonel Stevens gave a slow, solemn nod, his eyes shining with respect. The weight of Walter's truth had unfolded, reshaping the night completely. Ethan's smirk was gone, replaced by unease. For the first time, the fundraiser no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Walter, the veteran who built America's remembrance. The silence in the hall stretched long and heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Faces that once sneered now softened with realization, the weight of Walter's confession settling deep in their hearts. Men and women shifted in their seats, humbled by the revelation. Even the donors who once laughed now looked uneasy, their pride shaken. For the first time, the night felt truly sacred. Colonel Stevens stood straighter, his eyes locked on Walter with renewed respect. He knew now that this wasn't just an old carpenter with calloused hands. It was the man who had built America's places of mourning. He thought of the countless funerals, the folded flags, the benches where families wept. Walter's legacy wasn't hidden anymore. It was alive in every memory etched into those places. Emily clasped her tray to her chest, unable to stop the tears that blurred her vision. Her heart pounded as she looked at Walter, no longer invisible but radiant with dignity. She remembered sitting with her family years ago, grieving her uncle's loss, leaning against a wooden plaque outside the church. Could that plaque have been his? The thought filled her with awe. The donors' whispers shifted into reverent murmurs. "I've been to Arlington," one said softly. "I've sat on those benches." Another nodded, recalling memorials where names of fallen soldiers lined carved wood panels. Recognition rippled across the hall, turning arrogance into humility. The truth was undeniable. Walter's work had carried the grief of a nation. Walter's hands tightened on his cane, but his voice remained steady. "You called me useless tonight," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "But for decades you've bowed your heads at the work of these hands. Every tear you shed, every prayer you whispered, rested on what I built." His words cut through the silence, carving themselves into memory. The atmosphere shifted entirely. What began as a fundraiser now felt like a memorial service itself, infused with solemnity and reverence. Families in the crowd bowed their heads instinctively, as if acknowledging the sacred truth. Walter had spoken not with arrogance, but with the authority of sacrifice lived quietly and fully. Emily stepped closer, setting down her tray on a nearby table. Her voice, trembling but strong, carried into the still air. "You've built more than benches, Mr. Miller. You've built the places where America remembers its heroes." Her words trembled with sincerity, drawing a few nods and quiet affirmations from around the hall. Colonel Stevens raised his hand to his brow in a firm salute. The motion was deliberate, sharp, filled with respect. The veterans in the room, scattered among the donors and families, followed suit. One by one, hands rose to foreheads, until a wave of salutes filled the hall. Walter blinked, his chest tightening with emotion. For the first time in years, his service and labor were honored openly. The young waitress wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, overwhelmed by the sight. Ethan's stage, once a platform for arrogance, had become a stage for truth. Walter had not only defended himself, he had redefined the meaning of honor for everyone present. His legacy no longer lived in silence. It had been spoken into the light. As the echoes of respect filled the room, Walter stood quietly, humbled yet proud. He had never asked for recognition, never sought applause, but tonight the weight of history pressed gently on his shoulders, no longer as a burden, but as a crown. The hall would never see him as invisible again. Ethan's jaw tightened as the tide of the evening turned against him. He gripped the microphone, desperate to reclaim authority, his smirk faltering into frustration. The respect pouring toward Walter made his stomach churn with envy. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had planned to mock the old man into silence, not lose his grip on the room. He forced a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "So what?" He sneered, pacing across the stage. "You built furniture. Benches, plaques, wooden carvings. That doesn't make you important. It doesn't build the future." His words rang out, but they lacked the confidence that once commanded the hall. The crowd's silence was heavier than applause. Some donors shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to join Ethan's mockery anymore. The weight of Walter's revelation was still too fresh, too sacred, to be dismissed so easily. Colonel Stevens narrowed his eyes at the young developer, disgust etched across his face. Emily crossed her arms, glaring at Ethan with quiet defiance. His words no longer carried the same authority. Walter stood firm, unmoved by the insult. His gaze stayed steady on Ethan, the calm of a man who had endured storms far greater than ridicule. He didn't need to shout or argue. The truth had already been spoken. Ethan's attempts to bury it only revealed his own arrogance. The silence of the hall testified louder than his sneers. Ethan's voice rose, desperate to stir the crowd. "We don't honor men for swinging hammers. We honor visionaries, leaders, people who make real change." He gestured wildly, as though trying to pull the audience back under his control. But the words fell flat, bouncing off faces that no longer looked convinced. Emily stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "He built the places where we grieved our loved ones. You built speeches and empty promises. Tell me, Ethan, which one really lasts?" Her challenge struck like lightning, earning murmurs of agreement from the crowd. For the first time, Ethan looked rattled. Walter's silence grew more powerful with every passing second. He didn't need to defend himself anymore. Others were doing it for him. The colonel's salute, Emily's courage, and the audience's shifting hearts all stood as proof. Ethan was shouting into a void, his influence slipping like sand through his fingers. Ethan slammed a hand against the podium, his face flushed red. "You're all blinded by sentiment." He snapped, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is about money, power, and progress, not old men with stories." But instead of applause, his words were met with stony silence. The donors' eyes no longer followed him with admiration. Colonel Stevens rose from his seat, his voice sharp and commanding. "You've lost the room, son." His words carried the authority of a man who had lived through war and sacrifice. The crowd shifted, some nodding in agreement, others glaring at Ethan with open disdain. The young developer's arrogance had finally met its match. Walter exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving Ethan. The battle was not yet over, but the tide had shifted for good. Defiance could not erase truth, and as the hall settled into silence again, one thing was clear. Ethan's grip on the night was broken, and Walter's story was just beginning to rise. Walter's chest rose slowly as he faced the hall, his grip firm on the cane that had carried him through decades of quiet labor. The lights glared down, but he did not shrink under them. His eyes swept over the faces that had doubted him, mocked him, dismissed him. With steady breath he prepared to speak, not with anger, but with the dignity of a man who had lived his life in service. The hall fell still, waiting for his voice. "I was told tonight that I was useless," Walter began, his voice calm but unyielding, that these hands were relics of a past long forgotten. He raised his calloused palms slightly, letting the room see their scars and their strength. But these hands built the places where America bows its head. They carved the wood where mothers wept and fathers prayed. The words carried like stone dropped in water, sending ripples of silence across the crowd. Ethan shifted on stage, his smirk faltering, but Walter pressed on. You laughed at me, measured me by wealth I never had, by age you think has stolen my worth. But I tell you this, my life's work holds this nation's grief and honor. Every bench, every plaque, every carving bore the tears of families who sacrificed more than any fortune could buy. His voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from memory. Emily clutched her tray against her chest, her eyes shining. She had seen arrogance all night, but now she saw truth standing in front of her, raw and undeniable. Tears blurred her vision, yet she could not look away. She whispered softly, He's not just standing for himself, he's standing for all of them. The words hung in her heart like a prayer. Walter shifted his weight, tapping his cane once on the floor. The sharp sound echoed, pulling every eye back to him. These hands were mocked tonight, he said, his voice stronger now, but for decades you've bowed your heads at their work. You called me useless, but you prayed on benches I carved. You honored names etched by these fingers. You sought comfort in places my labor built. Each sentence struck with quiet power. The veterans in the room exchanged glances, their jaws tightening. They knew the truth of his words because they had walked those grounds. They had sat on those benches, mourned by those plaques, remembered brothers and sisters lost in service. One by one their hearts stirred with respect they could no longer keep silent. The tide was shifting before their eyes. Walter drew in a breath, steady and deep. I never asked for applause, never signed my name on the wood. I built in silence because it was never about me. It was about them, the fallen, the families, the memory of sacrifice. Tonight you ask me to prove my worth. I will not prove it with boasts. I will prove it with the truth you already carry in your hearts. His eyes swept across the hall. A tremor of emotion rippled through the donors. Some lowered their heads, ashamed of their laughter earlier in the night. Others clutched their glasses tighter, uncertain how to reconcile arrogance with reverence. Walter's words cut through pride like a blade, exposing the hollowness of Ethan's mockery. The air grew heavy, sacred, like a chapel before prayer. Emily's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, her hand trembled at her side, overwhelmed by the moment. She felt the weight of Walter's truth settle inside her chest, burning like fire. This wasn't just a veteran standing tall, it was America itself speaking through him. She wiped her tears quickly, afraid to miss a single word. Walter lowered his gaze, his speech done, his point made. He had not shouted, had not begged for respect. He had stood firm, let the truth speak, and let the hall decide for itself. The silence that followed was thick and unbroken. For the first time that night, Ethan's voice could not fill it. The crowd was no longer his. The night now belonged to Walter. For a long moment the hall remained frozen, no sound but the faint hum of lights overhead. Then, slowly, Colonel Stevens rose from his chair. His uniform jacket gleamed under the glare, his movements steady and deliberate. He raised his right hand in a crisp salute, his eyes locked firmly on Walter. The motion broke the silence like thunder, commanding the room's attention. Veterans across the hall followed, rising one by one, their hands lifted to brows in sharp salutes, a wave of respect sweeping across the crowd. Each salute was a statement, louder than applause, heavier than words. They had mocked the old man once, but now they honored him openly. The sight sent chills through the air, solemn and proud. Emily gasped, her hands pressed against her mouth. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks as she watched the transformation unfold. She had believed in Walter all along, but seeing the entire room rise to honor him broke her heart open with joy. She whispered, trembling, "They finally see him. They finally see." Her voice quivered, lost in the roar of silence. Colonel Stevens' voice rang clear, strong as iron. "This man's legacy will outlive us all." The words cut across the hall, carried not by volume, but by truth. Murmurs of agreement swelled. Some donors nodded solemnly, others bowed their heads, ashamed of the earlier laughter. The atmosphere had shifted from prideful arrogance to humbled reverence. Ethan stood frozen on the stage, gripping the microphone with trembling hands. His smirk was gone, his confidence shattered. He tried to speak, but no sound came. The crowd no longer looked at him. Every eye was on Walter. Every ounce of respect poured toward the man who had quietly built America's sacred spaces. Ethan's reign over the room was broken. Walter's eyes glistened as he took in the sight before him. He had never sought applause, never asked for recognition. Yet now men and women stood to their feet, saluting, bowing their heads, showing gratitude he never thought he'd live to see. His chest swelled, not with pride, but with humility. At last the silence of his labor had been answered. Emily stepped forward, setting down her tray as if shedding her roll for the night. Her voice, trembling but strong, carried into the crowd. "He built the places where America remembers its heroes," she said. "Every tear, every prayer, every moment of honor, we owe it to him." Her words struck deep, pulling nods and quiet affirmations from every corner of the hall. The donors rose next, hesitant at first, but soon standing alongside the veterans. Men and women who once mocked now wiped their eyes, caught in the weight of the moment. They could no longer deny the truth, no longer cling to arrogance. The crowd had turned fully, united in reverence for the carpenter who had built their nation's memory. Colonel Stevens dropped his salute and stepped toward Walter, his voice steady. "You are no relic, Mr. Miller. You are the foundation of remembrance itself." His words were both honor and confession, lifting Walter's legacy into the open where it belonged. The hall erupted not in laughter, not in mockery, but in solemn applause that rang with sincerity. Walter bowed his head slightly, overwhelmed yet steady. The night had transformed, not through wealth or speeches, but through truth revealed in the hands of an old carpenter. As the applause rolled on, Ethan stood silent, powerless, erased by the tide of respect. The fundraiser was no longer about money. It had become a memorial in its own right. The applause rolled on, not rushed or shallow, but steady and full of weight. Walter stood quietly in the glow of the moment, his cane firm in his hand, his eyes lowered in humility. He had never asked for this recognition, but now that it came, it filled the hall with a sacred stillness. The fundraiser was no longer about checks and speeches. It had become a living memorial to sacrifice and remembrance. Ethan remained frozen at the podium, his face pale, his smirk erased. The microphone in his grip no longer carried authority, it only amplified his defeat. He looked around the hall, but no one met his eyes. Donors turned away, ashamed to have followed his mockery. For the first time, the young developer understood what it meant to lose everything without losing a dime. Respect had slipped through his fingers, and it would not return. Colonel Stevens stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He extended his hand firmly to Walter, his grip steady, his voice solemn. "You've carried this nation's memory longer than we knew," he said. "Tonight we honor you not as a relic, but as a cornerstone." Walter nodded slowly, his chest tightening at the weight of the words. For once his silence was matched with open respect. Emily Carter wiped her cheeks, still trembling from the sight of veterans saluting. She walked to Walter's side, no longer just a waitress for the night, but part of the story itself. "You gave us places to grieve," she whispered, her voice breaking. "America owes you more than it can ever repay." Walter looked at her, eyes glistening, and gave a faint smile. In her courage he saw the future. The donors, humbled and quiet, began to move. Some approached Walter with bowed heads, offering handshakes that once seemed impossible. Others lowered their eyes, too ashamed to speak. One by one, the arrogance drained from the hall, replaced by reverence. The fundraiser had transformed into something richer than money could buy. Honor had taken the seat of wealth. Ethan finally stepped back, the microphone slipping from his grasp. His polished suit and sharp words no longer mattered. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked under the weight of the room's silence. He was not the leader anymore, he was the lesson. His downfall was complete, not in ruin, but in irrelevance. The hall had chosen its true builder, and it was not him. Walter exhaled deeply, steadying himself. "I never wanted my name carved into wood," he said, his voice calm and clear. "I only wanted families to have a place to bow their heads, to remember what was lost. If that's all I've given this country, then it was enough." His words carried like scripture, planting themselves in every heart present. The hall responded with solemn applause, rising again to their feet. Colonel Stevens raised his hand once more, not in salute this time, but in a gesture to the crowd. "Let this night be remembered not for wealth, but for legacy," he declared. "When the new Veterans Center is built, its heart will be shaped by M.R. Miller's vision." The crowd roared in agreement, no longer donors or guests, but witnesses to history. Walter's life's work had become their collective memory. Emily reached for Walter's arm, steadying him as the applause swelled. "You've given this nation places to heal," she said softly. "Now let us give you the honor you deserve." Walter bowed his head, humbled by the thought. He had lived a life in silence, and yet, tonight, the silence had spoken louder than any boast. His legacy was no longer hidden, it was alive in the hearts before him. As the evening closed, the flags on the walls seemed to shine brighter under the lights. The fundraiser was no longer about building the future center. It was about building remembrance itself. Ethan faded into the background, forgotten. Walter stood at the center, not as a relic of the past, but as a living reminder that true patriotism is carried not in wealth or speeches, but in hands that built the places where America bows its head. The night belonged to him.